Alright folks, tonight we aren't kicking things off with some philosopher or brainy mathematician. Nope, we're diving headfirst into the world of a bunch of frostbitten lunatics who thought cruising across the North Atlantic was just a casual day trip. The Vikings. So, before you get too comfy, take a quick second to give the video a thumbs up and subscribe, but only if you're really digging what I'm doing here. And drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It's always super cool to see who's joining us from all corners of the globe. Now, let's dim those lights a little, maybe switch on a fan to get that nice low background hum going, and ease our way into tonight's epic journey together. The very first thing every Viking learned about hitting the high seas wasn't some grand notion of courage, fancy navigation skills, or even how to swing a battle axe like a boss. It was cold. A seriously specific kind of cold. The kind that just burrows deep into your bones, makes your teeth ache like crazy, and starts whispering in your ear that maybe raiding monasteries in the sunny Mediterranean would have been a much smarter career choice after all. The North Sea doesn't give a darn about your big dreams, your supposed bravery, or your super cool Viking tattoos. It's a gray, icy graveyard out there with waves that are basically shaped like really terrible decisions you're about to make. And yet, for reasons that only the gods themselves and sheer, stubborn pig-headedness can explain, the Vikings sailed straight into it. Viking longships were seriously impressive feats of engineering back in the day. Fast, sleek, and about as cozy as being stuck in a coffin filled with seawater. They didn't have any cabins, no insulation to speak of, and definitely no cozy little below-deck area to escape to. You just stood there, you froze your butt off, and you prayed that your beard didn't snap off in the howling wind. At first glance, a Viking longship looks sleek, elegant, and powerful, the very image of naval supremacy. But then you realize that it's also basically a wooden popsicle stick with oars. It had beauty, yes, but comfort? Absolutely not. Calling it a home was like calling a coffin a compact apartment. Still, the longship was a masterpiece of practical design. Every curve, every plank, every tarseal seam served one single purpose: not sinking. And in the North Sea, that alone was a kind of luxury. But warmth? That was definitely extra. To keep out the wind, shipbuilders overlapped the planks in what's called clinker construction, sealing every gap with tar and animal fat. It worked surprisingly well, until the sea reminded you that tar only stops water, not cold. The ocean didn't even need to leak inside. It just reached right through the wood and strangled your soul. To make things a little cozier, the Vikings hung their shields along the ship's sides. The sagas tell us that this was for defense, but let's be honest, half the time it was probably just to block the wind from freezing their eyeballs. Those circular shields turned the ship into a kind of mobile windbreak, a floating burrito of misery wrapped in wood and frost. Some crews even stuffed moss and straw between the planks or under their sleeping spots in an attempt to create some kind of insulation. It helped briefly, but then it got wet, froze solid, and became just another part of the floor. If you could manage to pry it off in the spring, congratulations. You've just invented early Scandinavian flooring. When storms hit, the ship would flex and groan like it was a living thing, every board expanding, every seam threatening mutiny. Men would huddle down in the hull, shivering and praying that the engineering miracle beneath them didn't suddenly remember that it was made entirely out of trees. They wrapped themselves in furs, cloaks, and a healthy dose of denial, and then they proudly called it resilience. They huddled together under damp canvas and sang into the howling wind as if defiance itself could somehow generate heat. And maybe it actually did. Maybe that's why they managed to survive while softer men stayed safely at home, writing poetry about warmer climates. What they lacked in actual temperature, they more than made up for in sheer conviction. Their hearts were furnaces, fueled by pride, hunger, and an unwavering belief that they were absolutely the toughest people alive. And honestly, they probably were. Just try rowing through Arctic storms in what is essentially a glorified canoe, all while wearing wet wool underwear. They didn't need warmth to live. They needed a purpose. Every bone-chilling gust of wind, every frozen wave, every miserable night spent on the open sea served as a constant reminder of exactly who they were. People far too stubborn to simply die properly. To freeze quietly was pure cowardice. To keep rowing was heroism, and to actually make it home was nothing short of a miracle. And when they finally did reach land, blistered, half-frozen, and half-drunk, they didn't curse the cold. They actually thanked it. The sea had tested them, and they had somehow survived yet again. In their minds, the gods hadn't spared them out of some sense of mercy. They had spared them because there was simply no one else who could possibly take their place. That's the strange and peculiar beauty of Viking warmth. It wasn't found in fires or furs. It was found within their spirit, in their songs, in their unwavering courage, and in the way they could laugh while Mother Nature was actively trying to kill them for sport. Because when your world is made of ice and iron, true warmth isn't something that surrounds you. It's something that resides deep inside you, stubborn, blazing, and utterly unkillable. Records from parish courts are full of these kinds of contradictions. One minister was fined for having affairs with several women in his parish. Another was caught in bed with the wife of a church warden. Even bishops weren't immune. In 1551, the Bishop of Gloucester was accused of keeping a concubine disguised as a laundress. The irony was almost divinely inspired. The Church had broken away from Rome in the pursuit of moral clarity, but it found itself repeating the same old mistakes, only now in English. The people, however, weren't fooled. In taverns and marketplaces, they mocked the clergy with biting humor. "Our parson," one ballad joked, "preaches hellfire but keeps a warm bed." Satirical plays made fun of lecherous friars and hypocritical preachers, and pamphlets circulated with drawings of priests caught in scandalous embraces. The Reformation, which was supposed to cleanse the faith, had instead turned sin into entertainment. And yet, the Church endured, its priests forgiven, its followers resigned. Desire had proven to be stronger than dogma, more lasting than any decree. Even as sermons thundered about temptation, the pulpit itself became a symbol of it, because beneath every moral command was an unspoken confession that holiness and human desire were never really enemies, just uneasy companions. The Tudor Church hadn't gotten rid of lust. It had simply learned to preach over it, louder, longer, and with better lighting. By the late Tudor years, lust and holiness had learned to coexist, awkwardly but inevitably. The Church had changed its robes, rewritten its prayers, and buried its scandals under new laws. But human nature refused to obey theology. Behind every sermon on purity, the ghost of temptation still lingered. Even the most righteous clergyman, standing before his flock in candlelit sanctity, carried within him the same conflict that had haunted monks, priests, and nuns before him, the pull between the physical and the spiritual. In the center, a fountain or well shimmered under the open sky, feeding both thirst and spirit. Water was sacred, and so it flowed through channels and basins, cooling the dusty air as traders unpacked their treasures. In colder regions, some caravanserais completely enclosed their courtyards with domed roofs pierced by narrow skylights. In the desert, thick mud-brick walls kept the interior cool by day and warm by night. Builders understood the language of climate, a harmony between form and function that modern architects still admire. Many caravanserais even had small mosques or shrines built into their corners where travelers of every faith could pray. Hospitality, after all, wasn't just kindness. It was law. Decoration told another story. Stucco carvings, turquoise tiles, calligraphy, and geometric patterns adorned the walls, proof that even in remote deserts, beauty mattered. A Persian caravanserai might display Quranic inscriptions about generosity, while a Central Asian one bore stylized lions and suns, symbols of protection. These designs spoke across cultures, expressing one universal truth, a shared reverence for the traveler's journey. But perhaps the greatest artistry was invisible, the feeling of arrival. After days of heat, hunger, and uncertainty, stepping into the cool shade of a caravanserai was like stepping into civilization itself. It was more than just a building. It was a promise. Within those walls, strangers became guests, and weary men became part of something vast and connected. The architecture was stone, but the message was human. That even in the harshest places, there would always be room for you. For nearly 2,000 years, the Silk Road thrived, a thread of trade, faith, and friendship stretching across half the world. But even the strongest silk frays with time. By the 15th century, the same caravanserais that once pulsed with laughter and languages began to fall silent. The Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, was immediately fascinated by this intriguing Moroccan wanderer, and he appointed him to the prestigious position of royal judge, an honor that few foreigners had ever achieved. Ibn Battuta had successfully transitioned from pilgrim to scholar, and from scholar to respected statesman. Yet, even in a position of power and influence, he remained restless and yearned for more. The vast horizon continued to beckon him, and beyond the borders of India, the rest of the world still awaited his arrival. In Delhi, Ibn Battuta entered a world filled with both incredible magnificence and shocking madness. The city was a dazzling capital, teeming with grand palaces, magnificent mosques, and vibrant markets overflowing with a kaleidoscope of colors. But at the heart of it all ruled one of the most unpredictable and enigmatic monarchs in all of history, Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq, a man of immense intellect and even greater cruelty. While many scholars praised his brilliance and forward-thinking ideas, those who had survived his reign often described him as incredibly dangerous. For Ibn Battuta, serving in this court would prove to be both a great blessing and a severe trial. The Sultan appointed him as a qadi, or judge, granting him considerable wealth, numerous servants, and a lavish house to call his own. Almost overnight, the young man from Tangier became a figure of great influence, sitting beside powerful viziers and prominent generals in the court of one of the richest empires on earth. The Sultan, clearly impressed by Ibn Battuta's deep knowledge of Islamic law and his natural gift for diplomacy, often called upon him to mediate complex disputes or to represent the court in delicate foreign affairs. But beneath the glittering golden ceremony and outward displays of power, a deep sense of unease constantly lingered in the air. It was basically camping, except if camping involved a high risk of hypothermia, serious frostbite, and the occasional run-in with a sea monster. Every single wave that crashed over the side felt like a personal insult. The wind wasn't just cold. It was like a living, breathing thing that had a vendetta against you specifically. Helmets frosted over in like 2 minutes flat, beards turned into icicles hanging off your face, and eyebrows froze into the same expression of eternal regret that you'd probably have on your face anyway. The ocean spray didn't just splash you. It felt like tiny icy needles stabbing you, and lighting a fire was totally out of the question. One little spark on a ship that was sealed with tar, and congratulations, you've just become the world's first Viking flambe. So, they sailed on without any warmth, without any light to speak of, and without even the slightest clue why they ever thought this was a remotely good lifestyle choice. The guys bundled themselves up in these heavy wool cloaks, which were basically the medieval equivalent of damp bath towels, and pretended that it actually helped keep them warm. Wool smelled absolutely awful when it was wet, which it pretty much always was. But hey, at least it hid the tears freezing on your face, right? They lined the deck with straw, hoping to insulate it a little, though insulation really doesn't mean much when your boat is essentially a floating refrigerator. Sleeping was its own special brand of torture. The deck doubled as your bed, your pillow, and your own personal ice rink. You curled up next to like 20 other frozen dudes, all of whom smelled like a delightful mix of fear and dead fish, and hoped that no one rolled over in their sleep and stole your only pair of dry socks. There were these brief moments when the sea would calm down, becoming glassy smooth, still and eerily silent. And that's when the real horror would sink in. But for all of its flaws, the longship was also a kind of blanket, a thin, creaking shield between man and oblivion. It didn't keep you warm, but it gave you something to cling to while you were pretending not to die. Because for Vikings, that was usually enough. You didn't really need comfort, you just needed construction. You didn't need heat, you just needed hope. And if your ship didn't burn, sink, or split in half, well, that basically counted as a warm night. At some point, probably halfway through their third bout of frostbite, the Vikings decided that they deserved some kind of shelter. Not real shelter, mind you. Not walls, roofs, or anything remotely luxurious like that. Just a piece of canvas stretched over their heads so they could pretend that the sky wasn't actively trying to kill them. They called it a ship tent. and it was about as effective as holding a napkin over a bonfire. Made from coarse wool or sailcloth, it draped across the longship's center, anchored by oars, shields, and pure delusion. It didn't stop the cold, and it certainly didn't stop the rain. What it did stop was hope, and for morale that actually counted for something. Under this makeshift tent, 20 to 30 men would huddle together, packed tighter than salted fish. They'd lie shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in their wet cloaks, pretending to sleep while slowly marinating in each other's breath. The air inside the tent was thick with moisture, sweat, and regret. If you somehow survived the night, it wasn't because of warmth. It was because of mutual body heat and a shared refusal to admit defeat. Sometimes, condensation would build up on the inside of the tent until it started raining from within. The Vikings just called that weather. The modern term for it would probably be a cry for help. The real purpose of the ship tent wasn't actually warmth, though. It was an illusion. And that's how the Vikings ultimately conquered the cold, not by trying to escape it, but by somehow becoming even colder than the cold itself. The Tudor Church cloaked itself in a deceptive illusion of holiness. Each Sunday, incense swirled lazily through the frigid stone aisles as booming sermons thundered on about lust, gluttony, and every other imaginable sin. Priests, adorned in pristine vestments, stood before their devout flocks, their voices echoing with righteous words of purity. Yet, just behind the doors of the sacristy, when all the candles were snuffed out and the final prayers were said, that very same church transformed into a den of earthly temptation. Human desires, not holy doctrine, ruled the long nights. Celibacy, after all, was merely an ideal imposed by Rome, not a natural state of being for anyone. The clergy were officially expected to be married to God, but very few could actually resist the undeniable touch of the living. In parishes stretching from Canterbury all the way to York, whispers spread like wildfire about priests who shared their beds with their housekeepers, of monks who mysteriously vanished from the cloister after Compline, and of nuns who dared to dream not of Christ, but of carnal warmth and earthly pleasures. Everyone seemed to know about it, but no one ever dared to say it aloud. Confessionals, which were originally intended for repentance, instead became secret stages for forbidden intimacy. A young woman might kneel, her breath trembling with nervous anticipation as she confessed her impure thoughts, only to discover that her priest was listening just a little too closely, his questions just a bit too curious. "Do you think of him often?" he might ask, his voice low and suggestive, and she would answer softly, "Yes, Father." In the dim darkness, both the sinner and the confessor became distorted mirrors of temptation, each reflecting the other's hidden desires. The irony was almost poetic. The Reformation had promised a church free from corruption, a moral cleansing of England's soul. But in reality, it had only shifted the sin from confessionals to courts, from monasteries to royal chambers. Lust hadn't been defeated. It had been redistributed. The crown married and remarried. Courtiers traded favors in bedrooms as easily as in council halls, and priests continued to struggle with the very desires they condemned. The Tudor age, so obsessed with sin, was paradoxically one of its most fertile breeding grounds. Yet this conflict gave the era its unique humanity. The Tudor clergy, for all their hypocrisy, reflected the same contradictions found in every believer. They wanted to be pure, but they also wanted to be loved. They preached eternal salvation, but they longed for earthly warmth. The robes and rituals could hide desire, but they couldn't erase it. And so the Church, in all its grandeur and guilt, became a mirror of England itself, proud, pious, and perpetually tempted. When the final Tudor monarch, Elizabeth I, took the throne, she perfectly embodied this balance. The Virgin Queen ruled a nation filled with gossip about her lovers. Her courts sparkled with poetry and passion. Her priests preached restraint while musicians sang of longing. Holiness had become theater, and the audience loved every act. In the end, the hidden lusts of the Tudor Church weren't just sins. They were symptoms of being human. Beneath the hymns, beneath the robes, beneath the fear of eternal fire, beat the same unyielding truth, that desire, however forbidden, was part of creation itself. And though priests might burn for it, kings reform for it, and the faithful confess it, lust remained England's truest religion, the one faith the Tudor Church could never fully control. Long before the roar of engines or the clatter of trains, the ancient Silk Road pulsed with the slow, steady rhythm of camel hooves. Their courtyards, once crowded with camels and spice carts, echoed only with wind and the occasional traveler too stubborn to believe the world had moved on. The first blow came from the sea. When European explorers discovered maritime routes to India and China, the overland roads suddenly became slower, riskier, and less profitable. A ship could carry 100 times the cargo of a caravan, and no sandstorm ever swallowed a galleon. Merchants who once crossed Persia and Central Asia now sailed around Africa, trading silk for silver in bustling ports instead of barren deserts. The caravanserais, built to guard against bandits and thirst, couldn't defend against obsolescence. Then came war. The Mongol peace that had once protected traders gave way to fractured kingdoms and raiding tribes. Empires rose and fell faster than merchants could redraw their maps. Taxes multiplied, roads became unsafe, and many inns were abandoned, left to crumble beneath centuries of sand. Those that survived became villages, prisons, or ruins inhabited by shepherds and ghosts. The Silk Road's arteries dried up, and the heart, the caravanserai, ceased to beat. Yet decline didn't mean disappearance. In the quiet courtyards of these ruins, traces of the past still linger. Faded inscriptions in Persian and Arabic speak of hospitality and divine protection. Burn marks on stone recall the fires that once warmed travelers from a dozen kingdoms. Even now, wanderers who visit these remnants feel a strange familiarity. The echo of footsteps, the imagined scent of spices, the soft murmur of traders counting coins by lamplight. The caravanserais may have fallen. However, their impact lived on, transforming and adapting into new expressions. Think of the roadside inns that dotted Europe, the caravanserais, or KS, of the Ottoman Empire, and even the modern hotels we know today, all promising a safe and comfortable haven for weary travelers. Delhi was a city filled with spies and hidden agendas, where royal favor could vanish without warning, and where even the slightest act of disobedience was swiftly punished with brutal torture or death. In his Rila, Ibn Battuta describes the Sultan as a man of vast ambitions and equally vast anger. He witnessed numerous acts of extreme generosity, such as entire streets being fed from the Sultan's royal kitchens, followed by shocking acts of terror, when the very same kitchens ran red with the blood of executions. To live in his shadow was to constantly walk a tightrope between immense fortune and utter ruin. Still, despite the inherent dangers, Ibn Battuta skillfully navigated this perilous world with remarkable grace and intelligence. His natural charisma and ever-growing knowledge kept him in the Sultan's good graces, and his insatiable curiosity never waned. He thoroughly explored Delhi's bustling markets, carefully observed its numerous festivals, and diligently recorded the unique mingling of Persian, Turkic, and Indian traditions that made the city so remarkably unique. Yet, despite all the comforts and privileges he enjoyed, his wanderlust could not be tamed. He found the court to be rich and fascinating, but also felt increasingly trapped and confined. Sensing his underlying restlessness, the Sultan offered him a new and exciting challenge: to serve as his ambassador to China. The offer was both a great honor and a subtle form of dismissal. Ibn Battuta accepted it eagerly, as the thought of the open road was simply irresistible to a man born to constant movement and adventure. Delhi had certainly crowned him with prestige and influence, but his heart still belonged to the vast, beckoning horizon. In 1342, Ibn Battuta set out from Delhi as the Sultan's official ambassador to China, leading a grand caravan of servants, scholars, and skilled sailors. You'd look around and suddenly realize you couldn't feel your fingers, your toes, or even your will to keep on living. And yet, the Vikings just kept on sailing. Not because they were so incredibly brave, not because they were completely fearless, but because somewhere deep down inside, they knew one eternal truth. Freezing to death out at sea was still somehow more fun than farming turnips back in Norway after a long, back-breaking day of rowing through freezing hell. Now, you might be picturing these Vikings retreating to their cozy little cabins, lighting a nice crackling fire, and snuggling up in some warm furs. But you'd be dead wrong. There were no cabins, no fires, and definitely no snuggling. Unless you count collapsing next to some dude named Harold who hadn't taken a bath since last spring as snuggling. The Viking longship was this incredible marvel of simplicity. It was basically a giant wooden freezer that was disguised as a means of transportation. The deck was completely open to the elements. The wind was relentless and unforgiving, and everything, including you, was constantly damp. The North Sea didn't care one bit if you were tired. It wanted you tired and just a little bit dead. Sleeping arrangements were generous, in the same way that a coffin is spacious. Each guy got roughly half a meter of deck space, which was just enough to lie flat if you didn't mind having a shield boss digging into your spine all night. There were no mattresses, no blankets, just some straw scattered across the wooden planks to soak up all the seawater and human despair. By morning, it was all frozen into this crunchy layer of pure Viking regret. Their beds were just their cloaks, thick wool that was always wet and always smelled faintly of goat and defeat. Some guys used sheepskins or furs, but those froze solid too, turning every single nap into an archaeological experiment in extreme discomfort. You didn't just lie down to rest, you negotiated with the frostbite. When you're sleeping on an open deck with ice forming in your beard, even the faint shadow of a ceiling feels like a small piece of civilization. It created this tiny psychological distance between the great outdoors and utter despair. Every now and then, a strong gust of wind would tear the canvas loose, flapping it around like the sails of a ghost ship. Nobody ever really moved to fix it. They just sighed, accepted their fate, and added losing the tent again to the ever-growing list of life's many insults. But for all of its flaws, that sagging piece of fabric gave them the illusion of a home, a fragile barrier between the Vikings and the endless, freezing void. Because that's how Vikings survived. Not through comfort, not through luxury, but through the sheer, stubborn power of pretending that things were fine when absolutely nothing was fine. And somehow it worked. When you think of Viking feasts, you probably imagine these roaring halls, roasted boars, and overflowing mead horns. But on a longship, you can pretty much forget about all of that. Dinner out on the open sea was basically just punishment with extra calories. The menu never really changed. It was always cold, dry, and of questionable origin. Cooking on deck was strictly forbidden. Fire and wooden ships just didn't mix well, unless you liked your meals served with a side of screaming. So, every Viking voyage began with weeks of pre-cooked misery. Smoked fish, salted meat, and hard bread that was tough enough to qualify as armor. If you could actually chew it without breaking a tooth, you were already halfway to Valhalla. Breakfast was usually dried herring, washed down with a gulp of seawater that you probably swallowed by accident. Lunch was more dried herring, and for dinner, if you guessed dried herring again, congratulations. You could probably survive the North Sea. The irony was almost unbearable. Holy men preaching virtue by day and whispering their own secret sins by night. For many of these priests, desire wasn't a form of rebellion. It was a matter of survival. Parish life was often lonely, harsh, and terribly underpaid. The church demanded absolute chastity but offered no comfort, no warmth, beyond the cold and unfulfilling company of strict doctrine. And so, they rationalized their lust as a simple human weakness, something forgivable, even understandable. God forgives the frailty of man. One priest might mutter quietly after a particularly flagrant indiscretion, hastily adjusting his robes before the morning mass. Yet the contradiction festered and grew. The very same church that burned heretics at the stake for far lesser offenses quietly tolerated this widespread hypocrisy. It wasn't any sort of fervent zeal that kept the clergy even remotely pure. It was the ever-present fear of being caught. And even that fear seemed to dull over time, slowly replaced by a sense of weary familiarity. In the end, purity was just another performance, a carefully crafted charade. Priests wore robes to hide their bodies, burned incense to mask the scent of sin, and gave long, rambling sermons to distract the faithful from the raw, human desires pulsing beneath the altar cloth. The Tudor church certainly looked holy, but it definitely didn't smell that way. In the parishes of Tudor, England, the humble title of housekeeper had taken on a somewhat suggestive double meaning. Officially, she was simply the woman who cooked, cleaned, and generally took care of the priest's household. Unofficially, however, she was his solace and comfort during the long, lonely nights when scripture just didn't offer enough warmth. It was a quiet, unspoken scandal that everyone knew about, but no one dared to acknowledge directly. It wasn't just one road, but a vast network, a web of dirt and dust stretching from the great cities of China to the glittering ports of the Mediterranean. Silk, jade, and spices traveled west, while gold, glass, and stories flowed east. But none of this would have been possible without one crucial invention: the caravanserai, the traveler's fortress. Imagine trekking for days through the Gobi Desert. The wind stings your face, your lips crack, and the sand seems to swallow every sound. Then, on the horizon, you see it. Thick stone walls rising from the emptiness. A torchlit gate promising food, safety, and companionship. Stepping inside a caravanserai was like stepping out of danger. For merchants, it was a sanctuary. For monks, a place to preach. And for spies, a chance to listen. Each caravanserai was more than just a rest stop. It was a world contained within walls. Built about a day's journey apart, roughly 20 to 25 miles, they formed the backbone of the Silk Road. The architecture reflected both function and culture. Heavy gates to withstand attacks, inner courtyards large enough for caravans, fountains to wash off desert dust, and prayer halls for weary souls. Guards watched the gates while stable hands cared for the camels and horses, their bells tinkling softly through the night. But what made these places truly special wasn't the architecture. It was the humanity that filled them. Persian poets exchanged verses with Chinese scholars. Turkish nomads haggled with Venetian merchants over bolts of silk. Languages mixed, religions mingled, and recipes, maps, and rumors spread from person to person. The caravanserai was a crossroads of civilizations, part inn, part market, part university, and part whisper network. Here, globalization wasn't driven by ambition, but by necessity, by the shared struggle to survive deserts, mountains, and hostile people. The dust of the Silk Roads might have settled, yes, but the very essence of what they represented, that deep-seated spirit of exchange, that undeniable urge to connect across vast distances, that endured. The world gleaned a valuable lesson from the Silk Road's decline. Even when the physical roads themselves disappear, the stories carried along those roads, they never truly do. Today, the caravanserais of the Silk Road stand as scattered remnants of a forgotten age, silent, weathered by time, and partially swallowed by the relentless sands. Their walls might be crumbling, but their enduring memory lives on, deeply embedded within the DNA of our modern world. Consider this: every airport lounge, every simple roadside motel, every bustling border cafe, each owes a debt to these ancient sanctuaries of cultural and commercial exchange. They were, in essence, the very first global network, a network built not of cold cables or complex code, but of warm-blooded people. And within their welcoming courtyards, the world took its initial tentative steps toward true interconnectedness. Step into one of these historical ruins today, perhaps along the dusty, expansive plains of Uzbekistan, or amongst the striking red hills of Iran, and you'll feel it without a doubt. That unmistakable pulse of history. You can almost hear the faint, rhythmic jangling of camel bells carried on the wind, smell the rich spice of cardamom mingling with the scent of human sweat, and perhaps even catch the ghostly echoes of laughter from merchants who hailed from lands that, tragically, no longer exist. The stone structures may be broken and worn, but the central idea, that radically ancient belief in the importance of hospitality and unbridled curiosity, that remains completely intact. Civilization itself was fostered and spread, not by conquering armies and bloody battles, but by those intrepid travelers who shared meals and stories with complete strangers. The official mission was intended to strengthen vital trade and diplomatic ties between two great empires, the Delhi Sultanate and the Yuan dynasty of China. For Ibn Battuta, it was the perfect excuse to continue moving ever eastward, deeper into the unknown. Yet, destiny had other, far more challenging plans in store for him. What awaited him was not glory or easy success, but instead chaos, a perilous journey through treacherous monsoon seas, a dangerous mutiny, and several brushes with near-certain death. He first traveled south to the bustling port of Calicut, located on India's southwestern coast, where the humid air was thick with the potent scents of pepper and sea salt. The harbor teemed with ships from Arabia, Africa, and China, a veritable floating city of diverse languages and valuable cargo. The Indian Ocean trade routes were essentially the highways of the medieval world, connecting East Africa to the far-flung islands of Indonesia. But they were also notoriously treacherous, ruled by the unpredictable whims of wind and water. Ibn Battuta boarded a large Chinese-style junk, bound for the Malabar coast, and soon encountered the full fury of the annual monsoon season. The storm struck with the force of divine judgment, as towering waves rose higher than minarets and the howling wind roared like a ravenous beast. His fleet was quickly torn apart by the storm's unrelenting power. One of the ships, tragically carrying precious royal gifts, sank with all hands lost, while another was seized by ruthless pirates. Ibn Battuta himself barely escaped drowning, eventually washing ashore, half dead, his clothes torn to shreds, his ambitious mission completely ruined. He had originally set out as a proud ambassador, representing a powerful sultanate. Now he was once again a simple vagabond, stripped of his status and possessions. Yet, despite the crushing setbacks, despair never fully consumed him. The real trick to staying alive out there was all about layering up. Vikings wrapped themselves like human onions, with wool tunics, cloaks, and sometimes an extra pelt if they'd raided someone who was wealthier and warmer than they were. But no matter how many layers they piled on, the cold always found a way in, like that uninvited guest who shows up to dinner and brings pneumonia with them. And to make things even worse, sleeping near the edge of the ship meant you were guaranteed to catch the occasional splash of ice-cold salt water right in the face. Sleeping in the middle, on the other hand, meant getting trampled by the morning rowing shift. There was really no good spot to be found, just slightly less horrible options to choose from. And yet, somehow, they actually slept. Not comfortably, not warmly, but just out of sheer, bone-crushing exhaustion. Their bodies would just shut down before their brains could even remember that they were slowly dying of cold. Because on a Viking longship, sleeping well didn't mean waking up refreshed. It just meant waking up at all. When your entire ship is made of wood, tar, and Viking ego, you tend to develop a pretty healthy respect for fire. One misplaced spark, and congratulations, you've just invented the world's first floating bonfire. So instead of lighting campfires right on the deck like normal lunatics, the Vikings used something a little more subtle: smoldering embers. Each crew carried what they called the sleeping fire. It was basically a small metal or clay container filled with slow-burning coals buried in ash. It didn't burst into flames. It just glowed quietly, like the last little shred of hope on a freezing winter morning. The embers were usually tucked away under a clay pot or inside an iron brazier, which was pretty much the Viking equivalent of central heating. Except if your central heating came with a 50% chance of burning your whole ship down. Losing those embers was a seriously big deal. Fresh meat was a luxury that was usually reserved for the lucky guy whose hunting skills managed to somehow outperform his frostbite. Otherwise, you just gnawed on your supplies and dreamed about fire. Vikings stored their food in barrels that were sealed with tar, which meant that everything tasted faintly of ship. Butter, cheese, and grain were all lovingly infused with that signature seafaring flavor. And when mold appeared, which it always did, they just scraped it off and pretended that it was a new kind of seasoning. To keep their strength up, they ate fat, lots and lots of it. Whale blubber, pork grease, even melted animal fat smeared on bread like some kind of medieval margarine. Kept you warm, and it disgusted you in equal measure. Some sagas mention something called sea porridge, which was a charming blend of oats, water, and pure regret. It was thick, tasteless, and could probably have been used to patch a hole in the hull if you really needed to. Water just wasn't safe to drink. It went rancid in storage pretty quickly, so they usually relied on ale or mead. It was weak enough that it wouldn't kill you, but strong enough to make you briefly forget that you were sitting inside a floating freezer. Hydration by mild intoxication. That was the Viking way. And through all of this, they didn't really complain, at least not out loud. Food was just fuel, not something to be enjoyed. You ate because you had to row another 100 miles through a blizzard, not because you enjoyed the subtle notes of salted despair. So yes, they survived without warmth, without comfort, and without functioning taste buds. Because when you're a Viking, a full stomach basically counts as luxury, even if everything you eat tastes like a shipwreck. If warmth couldn't come from fire, the Vikings just found the next best thing: mead. Not because it actually worked, but because it made them care a lot less that it didn't. From the bishop's opulent palace all the way down to the local village tavern, the faithful would nod politely to Mistress Joan or Goodwife Alice, pretending not to notice how the priest's so-called servant shared his bedchamber and bore children who curiously resembled him in many ways. The hypocrisy was almost bureaucratic, a systemic part of the whole operation. Bishops only ever bothered to punish priests caught in flagrant incontinence when the rumors became so overwhelming that they simply couldn't be ignored any longer. The priest would pay his fine, perform his assigned penance, say a few rote prayers, and then quietly return home to the very same woman, patiently waiting for him by the fireside. The church publicly condemned lust and debauchery from the pulpit, but quietly tolerated it in the rectory, so long as the tithe money kept flowing and any public scandal remained carefully manageable. As one chronicler rather dryly remarked, "The priests will sin, the bishops will sigh, and the people will forgive, for all have need of each other." Some of these illicit relationships were surprisingly tender, even somewhat domestic. A few priests even lived openly as husbands, without the formal blessing of marriage, their wives managing the parish as efficiently as any vicar's spouse after the Reformation. Others, however, were far more predatory in their behavior. The combination of power and the intimacy of confession made for a truly dangerous environment. A frightened young girl seeking spiritual counsel could easily find herself cornered by the very man who was supposed to be saving her soul. One particularly weary bishop's report noted with sad resignation that certain members of the clergy would take women under color of service and make them concubines. It was written in formal Latin, but everyone clearly understood the translation. Lust cunningly disguised as duty. The villagers rarely protested, though. The Silk Road's treasures weren't just gold and silk. They were the ideas carried from one firelit courtyard to another. Each caravanserai was a heart beating quietly and faithfully, keeping the lifeblood of the ancient world flowing between east and west. Each caravanserai stood like a defiant island in a sea of dust, a fortress of hospitality in the midst of endless wilderness. From Anatolia to Persia, from the steppes of Samarkand to the oases of China's Taklamakan Desert, these roadside inns were built with the same goal: to protect life and commerce. No matter where a traveler came from, the sight of high walls and a heavy wooden gate meant safety, warmth, and a meal that wasn't dried camel jerky. Architecturally, the caravanserais were feats of ingenuity. Most had a single, massive gate that closed at sunset, and once it was shut, no one could enter or leave until dawn. Inside was a wide courtyard where merchants unloaded their goods. Bales of silk, spices in clay jars, sacks of saffron, and cages filled with parrots from India or falcons from Arabia. Along the walls were rows of arched chambers, some used as sleeping quarters and others as stables. A central fountain or well provided water for both people and animals, its sound mixing with the clatter of hooves and the murmur of dozens of languages. The design reflected both practicality and power. Caravanserais along Persian routes were often fortified, serving as military outposts as well. In Ottoman lands, sultans commissioned huge stone khans that looked more like castles than inns, symbols of royal protection over trade. Even the Mongols, masters of the open plains, built way stations where silk caravans could rest under guard, knowing that peace on the road meant profit for everyone. But beyond the walls and gates, the atmosphere inside was electric. Nightfall transformed each caravanserai into a miniature city. Modern archaeologists often refer to the caravanserai as an early infrastructure of globalization. But it was so much more personal and intimate than that dry term suggests. It was humanity's very first chat room, its first truly international marketplace, its first tentative peace treaty, signed not with ink, but born from sheer necessity. Within its protective walls, Differences blurred and faded as people huddled together under a shared roof, united by the common need for survival. It was here, in these welcoming spaces, that cultures collided, not with the clash of swords, but with the quiet exchange of stories. And so, the Silk Road became something far greater than a mere trade route. It evolved into a classroom for empathy, a place where understanding could blossom. Governments today often speak of reviving the Silk Road through the construction of modern railways and highways. But the most genuine and meaningful revival will always be spiritual, found in the recognition that connection, not conquest, is the true foundation upon which civilizations are built. The crucial lesson of the caravanserai is as simple as it is timeless, that the stranger who knocks at your gate might be carrying something far more valuable than mere goods. They just might be carrying the future itself. As the sun slowly sinks below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows from the old arches across the sand, it's as if those shadows are reaching out, longing for the return of travelers who will never come back. Yet, in a sense, we are all still walking that very road. Every message we send, every journey we take, every transaction we make across oceans and screens, the Silk Road has never truly disappeared. It has simply transformed, evolving into a new form. The spirit of the caravanserai lives on in every warm welcome, every meaningful exchange, and every shared campfire between strangers gathered under the same endless sky. He later wrote that every disaster was actually a blessing in disguise, a chance to learn and grow. Stranded but miraculously alive, he began again, traveling south along India's coast and then sailing to the idyllic Maldive Islands, where fate would take yet another unexpected turn. The islanders, deeply impressed by his vast knowledge and obvious intelligence, invited him to stay, and within a matter of months, he was appointed as their chief judge. In true Ibn Battuta fashion, he also married into the local royal family. For nearly 2 years, he lived amidst swaying palm trees and shimmering coral mosques, settling disputes about fishing rights and dowries instead of complex matters of state and dynasties. But such peaceful domesticity never truly suited him for long. The siren call of the ocean still beckoned him, as loud and insistent as a drum beat in his very soul. When he finally left the Maldives, he had lost his fortune, but he had also rediscovered his underlying purpose. The devastating storm had stripped away everything but what truly mattered, the unwavering will to keep moving forward, wherever the vast horizon might lead. Leaving the Maldive Islands behind, Ibn Battuta turned eastward once again, this time setting his sights on the exotic spice ports of Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, and the lands of Southeast Asia. The very sea that had nearly claimed his life before now became his chosen highway, his means of exploration. The monsoon winds carried him across an intricate web of trade routes that connected the medieval world's greatest civilizations, including Arabia, India, China, and Africa. Every port he reached offered a new language to learn, a new faith to explore, and a new rhythm of life to experience. He visited Ceylon, where ancient legends claimed that Adam himself had first descended to earth, leaving his sacred footprint atop a holy mountain. It meant no fire at camp, no cooked food, and no light to keep away whatever creepy creature was making that weird noise in the dark. A good crewman could keep those coals alive for days, blowing gently into the ash whenever the glow started to fade. You weren't just rowing a ship, you were basically babysitting a fire at the same time. At night, the men would gather around the brazier, holding their palms out, eyes half shut, and pretending like it was actually warm. The truth was, it really wasn't. The thing gave off less heat than a dying candle, but it was symbolic, a reminder that somewhere in this frozen purgatory, fire still existed. The embers weren't for cooking. Nobody risked that. Meals were always eaten cold or smoked long before they even set sail. The brazier's job was purely psychological. A little flicker of civilization in a world that was made entirely of wet wood and despair. Occasionally, the brazier would tip over in rough seas, filling the air with sparks and burning embers. This was usually followed by several minutes of screaming, frantic stomping, and heartfelt prayers to every single god in the Norse pantheon. Miraculously, most of them lived through it, which only reinforced the Viking belief that Odin himself was personally protecting them from their own stupidity. So no, they didn't heat their ships with roaring fires or clever engineering. They just kept this tiny little ember alive, the most fragile, inconvenient source of warmth imaginable. And somehow that was enough, because that's what Vikings did best. They took something small, dangerous, and barely functioning, and they called it innovation. The Vikings called it the sleeping fire, which was a pretty poetic name for something that mostly refused to cooperate. It wasn't a flame, but just a smolder, a slow, stubborn glow hidden under layers of ash. A tiny ember, small enough to cradle in your hands, but important enough to fight over. Mead was pretty much the Viking solution to every problem they faced. Cold, boredom, fear, existential dread, the sound of 20 men snoring in unison. You name it, they probably drank about it. Made from honey, water, and wild yeast, it was sweet, strong, and deceptively cheerful, like drinking liquid courage that was brewed by someone with a pretty serious head injury. On land, it was considered something sacred. In the sagas, warriors would toast the gods with it before battle, claiming that Odin himself drank the same stuff up in Valhalla. Out at sea, it was a little more functional. You didn't exactly raise a horn to honor Thor. You just drank straight from the barrel in an attempt to forget that your boots had frozen to your feet. Mead was stored in wooden casks, carefully sealed with tar and optimism. Over time, it definitely picked up a pretty distinct flavor, which historians generally describe as tasting like the inside of a Viking. But it wasn't really about the taste, anyway. It was about pretending that the warmth in your chest wasn't just your body slowly giving up. There's this popular myth that alcohol actually warms you up, and the Vikings completely believed it. In truth, it just widened your blood vessels, tricking you into thinking that you weren't actually freezing. It's the same kind of warming sensation that happens right before you get frostbite. But try telling that to a crew of half-frozen berserkers with mugs of mead in their hands. They really didn't care. Science hadn't exactly been invented yet. A few cups in, and morale would usually rise pretty quickly. Men would sing louder, laugh harder, and suddenly the blizzard didn't seem quite so bad. They'd shout about glory, honor, and occasionally just fall overboard. If the sea gods were feeling merciful, they'd float. If not, well, at least they died warm on the inside. A beloved priest who had christened their children and buried their dead could hardly be cast out for what was often dismissed as simple human weakness. And in a society that was already so deeply steeped in sin and repentance, who could honestly claim to be without fault? So, as long as the sermons continued and the church bells rang faithfully for Mass, the carefully constructed facade of holiness held firm. But behind the altar, the double life of the Tudor priest thrived. A life where the forbidden often felt sacred, where desire found its secret loophole in confession, and where the church, despite all its immense authority, could never quite silence the persistent pulse of human flesh beneath the cassock. Within the imposing stone walls of Tudor's various monasteries, the relentless battle between the body and the spirit was fought every single day, and often lost before the sun even rose. Monks were meant to live as the church's dedicated soldiers of purity, rising before dawn, engaging in strict fasting, constant chanting, and carefully shunning all forms of worldly pleasure. But human nature simply doesn't surrender so easily, not even to God. In the oppressive silence of the cloister, where the mind was supposedly focused on the divine, it often wandered elsewhere, to fleeting memories of women, to elaborate and longing dreams, to the soft, tantalizing scent of the world that lay just beyond the high walls. For many monks, temptation wasn't some kind of sudden fall from grace. It was a slow, gradual erosion of their willpower. The endless repetition of prayer and ritual tended to dull the senses, leaving the imagination free to roam wherever it shouldn't. A pretty pilgrim might pass by the abbey gate, or a young novice might kneel just a little too close during Vespers. Even such seemingly small moments could ignite a violent storm of guilt and uncontrollable desire. Merchants compared prices by torchlight, musicians strummed lutes, and storytellers recited epics of kings and gods to an audience of traders half asleep on rugs. Here, a Chinese Buddhist might share tea with an Armenian jeweler, while a Persian poet debated scripture with a Syrian monk. Languages collided, and with them ideas, artistic, religious, and scientific. These inns were more than just buildings. They were engines of civilization. Every caravanserai was a spark in the vast web of human exchange, a node connecting worlds that might otherwise never have met. Behind those thick, dust-stained walls, globalization wasn't a modern concept. It was a nightly routine fueled by spices, stories, and survival. Before dawn, the caravan stirred. Bells jingled, camels groaned, and men shouted in a dozen languages as torches flickered against the caravanserai's inner walls. The merchants of the Silk Road were the lifeblood of this ancient highway, a restless group of traders, dreamers, and gamblers who risked everything for the promise of profit and prestige. They came from everywhere: China, India, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Some carried silk and porcelain, while others sold glass, wool, or gold. What united them wasn't faith or origin, but the endless road itself. A typical caravan could include hundreds of animals and dozens of men. Camels were the ships of the desert, patient, smelly, and indispensable. Horses carried messengers, donkeys hauled smaller loads, and guards rode at the flanks with curved sabers glinting in the sunrise. Each merchant had a role. The leader, or caravan bashi, set the pace and managed disputes. Scribes recorded transactions in careful ink, and cooks prepared flatbread, stew, and dried fruit to feed the company. To travel the Silk Road was to live as one organism, bound by trade and trust within the safety of a caravan. In the summer of 1325, a young 21-year-old law student from Tangier, Morocco, packed his saddlebags with care, mounted his trusty horse, and set off eastward, traveling alone. His name was Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta, and he announced that he was embarking on a journey to Mecca to fulfill the sacred pilgrimage that every Muslim is obligated to make at least once during their lifetime. However, what began as a simple act of religious devotion would soon transform into one of the most extraordinary and groundbreaking journeys in the entire medieval world. A journey that would carry him across vast stretches of Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, and even distant China. Over the course of nearly 3 decades, he would travel an astounding distance of more than 75,000 miles, a feat of exploration that no known explorer before him had ever even come close to matching. Ibn Battuta's world was immense and far-reaching, yet it was also deeply interconnected, skillfully stitched together by the shimmering golden threads of Islamic trade routes and a pervasive culture of generous hospitality. From Morocco's rugged Atlantic coast all the way to the very heart of Central Asia, an invisible but incredibly strong network of inns, learned scholars, welcoming mosques, and bustling markets stood ready to embrace any traveler who uttered the simple greeting, "Assalamu alaikum," peace be upon you. Wherever he journeyed, the shared faith that united this world acted as a guarantee, ensuring him shelter, safety, and often, even unexpected opportunities. As the son of a respected family of judges, Ibn Battuta possessed a strong foundation in reading, writing, and legal argumentation skills that would undoubtedly open countless doors for him along his way. While his initial destination was Mecca, he later wrote, "I set out alone, without companion or caravan, for the love of travel was implanted in my soul by God." Ibn Battuta bravely climbed it barefoot, deeply moved by its unique mix of Islamic, Hindu, and Buddhist devotion. To him, this peaceful coexistence was proof of Islam's universal nature, a faith capable of adapting, blending, and ultimately surviving even at the farthest edges of the known world. In his detailed writings, he vividly described the island's lush tropical forests, its jeweled kings, and its impressive elephant caravans, marveling at how the torrential tropical rain could seemingly drown the entire horizon in a matter of moments. From there, he sailed to the bustling Strait of Malacca, where merchants from China, Sumatra, and Arabia gathered to trade valuable pepper, silk, and fine porcelain. The humid air was thick with the sounds of many languages and the latest gossip. Ships from every imaginable coast anchored side by side, their decks laden with goods and carefully guarded by men whose faces reflected every possible shade of the known world. Here, Ibn Battuta witnessed a remarkable level of global exchange that few medieval Europeans could have ever even imagined. It was a vibrant, multicultural sea, bound not by strict borders or political allegiances, but by the power of the wind and the fragile bond of mutual trust. But the ocean remained as unpredictable as ever. Ruthless pirates roamed the waters, violent storms struck with very little warning, and navigation relied almost entirely on careful observation of the stars and the accuracy of human memory. He survived by relying on his deep faith and his ever-growing reputation. As a respected Qadi and holy man, he was largely protected by the very networks of Islam that stretched from Morocco all the way to China. Wherever he traveled, there were welcoming mosques, learned scholars, and generous merchants ready to greet him with the same familiar words of peace. By this point in his incredible journey, Ibn Battuta had traveled further than nearly any man alive. It was fire in hibernation, and just like every Viking on that ship, it was just one bad gust of wind away from giving up completely. The ember box was treated like some kind of holy relic. Losing it meant humiliation, starvation, and another long night of pretending to enjoy frozen fish. Crews guarded it the same way modern people guard their phone batteries. Obsessive, panicked, and with this deep sense of existential dependence. If the fire died, morale sank right along with it. Because when your gods live way up in the sky and your feet are constantly living in ice water, that little glow feels like the only real proof that you're still alive. Each morning, someone would be assigned to check on the ember box. The unlucky soul would have to crouch over it, blow gently, and hope that the coals were still breathing. If they weren't, congratulations. You've just become the least popular man on the entire ship. There were no second chances. You'd have to make new fire from scratch using flint, steel, and whatever little bit of will to live you had left. Doing that with frozen fingers on a moving deck was about as easy as building IKEA furniture in the middle of a hurricane. When the ship finally reached land, the sleeping fire would be awakened again, stirred, fed, and coaxed back into life. The crew would gather around it like it was some kind of returning god. They'd roast meat, dry their clothes, and sit in blissful silence, all pretending that they hadn't spent the last week arguing with a piece of metal and ash. Some sagas described the Ember Keeper as a sacred role, while others described it as a punishment. Either way, it was pretty stressful. You weren't just carrying warmth. You were carrying everyone's sanity in a jar. Drop it, and you'd probably wish the sea had taken you first. So, no, the Vikings didn't have fireplaces or fancy heating systems. By morning, the hangovers were pretty heroic. The salt wind, the pounding heads, the dry mouths, the Viking trinity of regret. And yet, the moment the next barrel was opened, they'd pretty much forget all about it. Because when the world is frozen and the gods are silent, a cup of mead isn't just a drink. It's a tiny little rebellion against the cold. Warmth may be an illusion, but it's one that the Vikings were happy to drink to. When all else failed, when the fire was gone, the mead was empty, and the cold had crawled deep down into their souls, the Vikings turned to the oldest heat source known to humankind: each other. Yes, that's right. Viking survival strategy number 4 was the ancient Scandinavian art of "please don't die next to me. I really need your body heat right now." On long ships, personal space simply didn't exist. It was either everyone's warmth or everyone's funeral. At night, the crew would lie shoulder to shoulder beneath their damp wool cloaks, forming one large collective disappointment. The sagas often call them ship brothers, while archaeologists usually just call it necessary. Modern people would probably call it trauma bonding. Either way, it definitely worked. Each man was both the heater and the heated. If one guy rolled over in his sleep, everyone else would freeze. If someone got up to go pee, about 10 curses would follow him out onto the deck. There was no privacy to be found, just a tangled mess of limbs, fur, and existential crisis. By dawn, you really couldn't tell where one Viking ended and another one began, physically or emotionally. To outsiders, it might all sound a little strange. To Vikings, it was just Tuesday. Warmth was simply warmth. Dignity was secondary. They weren't cuddling for affection. They were cuddling for thermodynamics, pure and simple. The only thing more uncomfortable than the situation itself was attempting to explain it to anyone afterward. Even their clothing was designed to function as a team. Some monks confessed to experiencing vivid visions of demons, while others simply admitted to seeing women. Both were treated with a great deal of suspicion by their superiors. Records from the period reveal some startlingly honest confessions. In one visitation report, an abbot wrote with obvious frustration that his brothers confessed to experiencing carnal fantasies on a nightly basis and constantly begged for correction of the flesh. Another admitted that one particularly troubled monk had fled the abbey altogether in order to live with a brewer's widow. Discipline was often swift, but it was rarely particularly effective. A week of strict fasting, public humiliation, or even a cold flogging simply couldn't cure what centuries of repression had utterly failed to extinguish. The irony was almost cruelly humorous. The more strictly a man was told to deny his own basic nature, the more relentlessly it haunted him. Some monks turned their guilt into a form of fanatic devotion, punishing their bodies in a desperate attempt to silence the ever-present voice of desire. Others grew increasingly bitter and cynical, openly mocking their vows in private, secretly drinking ale behind the garden wall, or sneaking out to nearby villages under the comforting cover of darkness. The Church, of course, called it weakness. They often called it mere survival. When Henry VIII's sweeping Reformation finally came, the subsequent dissolution of the monasteries exposed just how very human these so-called holy men truly were. Royal inspectors found evidence of secret lovers, illegitimate children, and clandestine stashes of ale and gold, carefully hidden away. The monasteries, which had once hidden the constant battle between flesh and faith, were now laid bare for all to see, and England soon discovered that even the most pious of robes simply couldn't conceal the oldest sin of all: the desperate craving to be touched, to be loved, to be truly human. Inside a caravanserai, rival traders might share a meal, swap stories, or strike a bargain that would ripple across continents. A Persian spice dealer might sell cardamom to an Italian merchant who would later carry it by ship to Venice, where nobles would sprinkle it on their feasts as a symbol of wealth. A Chinese silk master might trade bolts of embroidered fabric for Arabian glassware, delicate, shimmering, and highly prized back home. In this way, entire economies depended on these nightly exchanges under foreign stars. But travel was dangerous. Bandits lurked in the mountain passes, sandstorms swallowed entire convoys, and illness struck without warning. Caravanserais were the fragile link between survival and oblivion. Reaching one by nightfall was a victory. Missing it was gambling with death. And so every merchant's map was marked not only with routes, but with the names of inns, safe havens that offered protection, warmth, and rumors. For these traders, the road was more than just commerce. It was destiny. They were the arteries of the ancient world, carrying goods, gossip, and gods across deserts and empires. Each caravanserai was their heartbeat, pulsing, echoing, keeping civilization alive one weary step at a time. If the desert was silent, the caravan was its opposite. A storm of voices, laughter, and rumors echoing through the night. By day, it was a fortress. By night, a parliament of the world. Merchants, monks, envoys, and wanderers gathered around fires, trading not only goods, but secrets. A caravanserai was a marketplace of information where the fates of empires could be whispered over a bowl of lentil stew. News traveled faster here than on any royal road. A merchant from Samarkand might arrive with word that the Khan of the East was raising taxes. A Persian courier would swear that the Ottoman Sultan was preparing for war. He eagerly joined merchant caravans as they traversed North Africa, enduring both intense thirst and debilitating illness, and narrowly escaping dangerous Bedouin raids. However, each and every hardship only seemed to pull him further and further away from the familiar comfort of home, and deeper into the fascinating tapestry of history. By the time he finally reached the vibrant city of Cairo, he had already crossed numerous kingdoms and vast deserts, and something profound had undeniably shifted within him. The pilgrimage alone was no longer enough to satisfy his growing wanderlust. The world itself had become his true calling. In Cairo, he stood in awe of a city that seemed to never sleep, a place where brilliant scholars passionately debated, bustling markets roared with activity, and magnificent mosques gleamed like shimmering palaces. It was here, amidst the energy and excitement of Cairo, that Ibn Battuta's insatiable curiosity began to overshadow his initial piety. He eagerly listened to the captivating tales of sailors recounting India's legendary riches, the intriguing stories of merchants speaking of the fabled golden lands of Marley, and the accounts of envoys describing the wonders of faraway China. Each whispered rumor became an irresistible invitation, and so, the devout pilgrim slowly transformed into a restless wanderer. What had begun as a journey purely focused on reaching Mecca evolved into a lifelong adventure across the known world, driven not by the desire for personal wealth or imperial power, but by the thirst for knowledge, the power of faith, and the endless wonder of human connection. The road to Mecca was far from a simple path. Instead, it proved to be a true gauntlet of challenges. As Ibn Battuta bravely crossed North Africa, the imposing Sahara Desert loomed before him like a shimmering mirage of death. What had originally begun as a simple religious pilgrimage had transformed into something far greater, an unending exploration of the world's remarkable diversity, all unified under the common banner of faith. As his ship finally set sail toward China, he gazed eastward across the vast horizon, toward the final frontier of his incredible odyssey, where the rising sun promised both untold wonders and unforeseen perils. In 1346, after spending decades on the road, Ibn Battuta finally reached China, the eastern edge of the known world. Very few Muslim travelers before him had ever ventured so far, and even fewer had ever returned to tell the tale. To him, it was like stepping onto an entirely different planet. Well-ordered, immensely vast, and astonishingly advanced. Cities stretched further than the eye could possibly see. Rivers swarmed with countless boats, and markets overflowed with exquisite porcelain, fine silk, and fragrant spices. China was not just a land. It was an incredibly sophisticated civilization that seemed to move with clockwork precision. He entered China through the southern ports of Guangzhou and Xuanzhou, where Arab and Persian traders had long established thriving and influential communities. There, beautiful mosques stood proudly beside ancient pagodas, and the traditional Islamic call to prayer mingled peacefully with the ringing of ornate temple bells. To Ibn Battuta, this remarkable coexistence served as undeniable proof that Islam had successfully reached even the most remote corners of the earth. He marveled at the ingenuity of Chinese craftsmanship, carefully describing their paper money, their intricate bridges, and their artful ships, some of which featured multiple decks and watertight compartments, far superior to anything he had ever seen in the Indian Ocean. Yet, China also deeply bewildered him. Its customs were incredibly foreign, and its people were disciplined to the point of appearing almost silent and emotionless. They had one half-dead ember rattling around in a clay box, and the faith of men who were too cold to even question why. The fire slept, but it dreamed of better owners. When it came to clothing, the Vikings had basically one rule. If it keeps you alive, then it's fashion. Forget all about elegance and style. This was pure survival couture. The North Sea didn't care if you looked heroic. It only cared whether your internal organs froze before you even had breakfast. Every Viking outfit started with wool. Thick, itchy, and perpetually damp wool. Wool tunics, wool trousers, wool socks, and wool cloaks. They basically lived inside a mobile sheep. Trapped air to keep you warm, absorbed water like a sponge, and smelled like a wet farm animal because that's exactly what it was. The Vikings didn't seem to mind all that much. The smell probably kept both frostbite and unwanted personal space at bay. On top of that, they'd wear animal hides. Deer, bear, seal, and reindeer. Basically, anything that had once moved faster than a Viking with a club. The hides were heavy and stiff, but they did a decent job of blocking the wind. Furs lined their cloaks and hoods, forming what scholars now call the Viking sauna aesthetic. It was functional layering centuries before the North Face even figured it out. The goal was pretty simple. Create as many barriers as possible between your skin and the impending apocalypse. Some warriors even wore multiple tunics, not because they were fashion-forward, but because they hadn't quite discovered the concept of laundry yet. Boots were a whole other story. Viking footwear was more of a concept than something designed for actual comfort. Leather bound with cords, stuffed with dry grass or moss for insulation. It worked surprisingly well, until the grass froze solid, turning every step into a fun little game of how much pain can you hide while still pretending to be fearless? One man's cloak would be draped over both of them, effectively trapping air and creating something akin to an early medieval sleeping bag. The odor was intense, a potent cocktail of sweat, salt, and despair, strong enough to strip the paint right off a shield. But within that pungent aroma lay survival, the body's unwavering and stubborn refusal to give in. And the truth is, it bonded them, both literally and figuratively. Brotherhood wasn't forged on the battlefield. It was forged under a damp, shared blanket, while everyone pretended to be asleep. No one who managed to survive that level of shared suffering ever questioned anyone's loyalty again. The Vikings didn't discuss it much, and frankly, you probably wouldn't either. But every saga of bravery, every epic tale of conquest, quietly began right there, with half-frozen men huddled together in the darkness, sharing what little warmth they had remaining. They didn't just survive the cold. They outlasted it by transforming themselves into the very fire they lacked. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was warm. And in those circumstances, that was more than enough. When you can't feel your fingers, your feet, or even your will to live, there's really only one thing left to do. Start singing. And that's precisely what the Vikings did. Music wasn't merely entertainment. It was a survival mechanism, plain and simple. When the deck of your ship was a frozen buffet of planks, and your beard was pulling double duty as an icicle collection agency, singing kept the blood flowing and the madness at bay. Rhythm provided warmth with structure. Harmony gave misery some much-needed company. It was essentially Viking therapy, just without the couch or any real coping skills. The songs were simple. Chants, rowing tunes, war hymns. Each one carefully crafted to make 20 men pull oars in perfect synchronization while they all tried to ignore the fact that their joints were probably crystallizing. The confessional, that narrow wooden box where troubled souls were meant to be cleansed of their many sins, often became the Tuda Church's most intimate stage for earthly temptation. In theory, it was supposed to be sacred ground, a place set apart. On one side sat the priest, on the other, the penitent, with only a thin veil of secrecy separating them. But secrecy, much like silence, can often breed danger. The already thin boundary between genuine spiritual guidance and mere personal curiosity was stretched perilously thin, and many priests, who were already burdened by their own forbidden urges, crossed it far too easily. A confession could easily begin innocently enough. A young woman might whisper that she was experiencing impure thoughts about a man, perhaps her husband's close friend, or perhaps even the priest himself. The priest would then press for further details, insisting that complete and total honesty was absolutely necessary for absolution. Her cheeks would flush with embarrassment as she reluctantly obeyed, unaware that each word she spoke was only fanning the flames of the priest's own forbidden imagination. He might then counsel her to fervently pray for purity, or he might simply linger on the memory of her confession long after she had left, clutching his rosary tightly like a fragile lifeline against the overwhelming tide of his own desire. There are numerous historical accounts of confessors who took full advantage of this almost sacred privacy. Some used their powerful position to manipulate frightened and vulnerable women, promising forgiveness in exchange for unspeakable favors that could never be spoken aloud. Others somehow convinced themselves that they were actually helping, that truly understanding sin required experiencing it firsthand. It was self-delusion dressed up in pious language, lust carefully wearing a deceptively angelic halo. Bishops occasionally received formal complaints, but most were simply buried with a weary sigh. A monk from India might murmur about a new sect, while a trader from Venice reported that silver prices had fallen across the sea. Every story was part truth, part invention, and every listener became both student and spy. In an age without newspapers, caravanserais were the world's wireless network. Dusty, noisy, and utterly indispensable. The gossip didn't stop with politics. There were tales of bandits and ghosts that haunted certain passes, of lost caravans swallowed by dunes, of kings who paid in pearls, and emperors who collected mechanical birds. These stories drifted west with the merchants and east with the monks, mixing with legend until rumor became history. Even myths had mileage. A traveler could leave China hearing of dragons and arrive in Persia believing they'd been sighted. For many, the gossip was more valuable than the trade itself. Monks learned of distant shrines and relics, explorers gathered hints of new lands, and rulers sent spies disguised as merchants to listen and report. A well-placed rumor could bankrupt a rival or spark an alliance. The innkeeper, often overlooked, became the gatekeeper of this invisible empire, his ears sharper than any sword, his memory more dangerous than any army. But beneath all the chatter lay something deeper: connection. The caravanserai was the one place where enemies could eat from the same pot, where a Christian could share wine with a Muslim, and where a Buddhist could trade blessings for salt. In the flicker of lamplight, the divisions of empires blurred, replaced by a common truth that every traveler understood. The road was long, the world vast, and survival required both trade and trust. Long before merchants brought silk to Rome or spices to Venice, monks carried something even more enduring: ideas. Along the Silk Road, the caravanserais became unlikely monasteries, spiritual pit stops where faiths met, mingled, and sometimes clashed. Entire caravans vanished into its seemingly endless dunes, their bones eventually swallowed by the unforgiving wind and relentless march of time. To survive in such a harsh environment required unwavering discipline, unshakable faith, and a healthy dose of pure luck, three vital elements that Ibn Battuta would come to rely on throughout the remainder of his life. He first traveled through Algeria and Tunisia, seeking shelter in mosques or with kind Sufi scholars who generously offered hospitality to any pilgrim bound for the holy city of Mecca. The desert was vast and unforgiving, but it was far from empty. Along its arteries pulsed a steady rhythm of trade and unwavering faith, with camel trains carrying precious salt, gleaming gold, and luxurious silks. Dervishes could be seen spinning in fervent prayer at roadside shrines, while merchants whispered sacred verses from the Quran before setting out at the break of dawn. In this world, religion served as both a compass and a form of currency. A man who prayed was generally considered a man to be trusted. Still, despite the inherent sense of community, danger was ever present. Violent sandstorms struck without any warning, instantly transforming the bright daylight into swirling chaos. Ruthless thieves stalked the lonely paths, always listening for the telltale sounds of jingling bells or approaching hooves. Ibn Battuta's small group was once ambushed near the dangerous Libyan frontier, and he only managed to survive by bravely hiding beneath the body of a dead camel until the safety of nightfall arrived. In his later writings, he would refer to such harrowing moments as tests of endurance, sent by God to strengthen his resolve. But even amidst the fear and uncertainty, he still managed to find moments of profound beauty. He wrote that the desert at sunset burned like molten gold, before the soothing mercy of night slowly cooled its fiery intensity. "They have no religion of revelation," he wrote, expressing both his fascination and his underlying unease. Still, he greatly admired their dedication to justice, their impressive level of organization, and the overall cleanliness of their cities, qualities that he compared favorably to the great capitals of the Muslim world. He visited the bustling city of Hangzhou, calling it the largest city under heaven, and Beijing, where the Mongol emperors ruled from vast and awe-inspiring golden halls. Everywhere he traveled, he found traces of the same interconnected global world that he had spent his entire life exploring. He saw Arab merchants in the bustling harbors, skilled Persian doctors serving at the imperial court, and African sailors working diligently in the busy docks. China was far from isolated. Instead, it was intricately connected, humming at the very far end of the same global network that began in Morocco. Ibn Battuta, standing in the Empire of the Dragon, had successfully followed that connecting thread to its ultimate end. But the long road had finally begun to tire him. His beard was now streaked with gray, and his body was marked with countless scars from his many travels and the relentless passage of time. After being away from home for nearly 3 decades, the deep longing for familiarity stirred within him, growing stronger than his insatiable curiosity. The man who had once eagerly set out to see all the world's wonders had finally seen them all. And now, for the first time in his adult life, he wished only to return to the place where his incredible journey had first begun. By the time Ibn Battuta finally turned westward, setting his sights on home, He was no longer the same naive young pilgrim who had left Tangier 3 decades earlier. He had bravely crossed the vast lengths of Africa and Asia, survived terrifying storms, navigated treacherous courts, endured bloody wars, and even survived devastating shipwrecks. Colors were mostly muted, browns, grays, maybe a little bit of red if you just rated someone with decent taste. Dyes were expensive and completely unnecessary. Nobody really cared about fashion critiques when their eyebrows were frozen together. Jewelry, though, that was their one indulgence. Rings, brooches, armbands, all gleaming under the frost. If you were going to freeze to death, you might as well look rich while doing it, right? And while the sagas often paint them as these rugged gods of war, most Vikings probably looked more like sleep-deprived lumberjacks wrapped in roadkill. Their outfits dripped with seawater, sweat, and animal fat. And somehow, that still wasn't the worst smell on the ship. But their layered madness actually worked. The wind could cut, the sea could bite, and the gods could mock, but the Vikings managed to stay alive. Uncomfortable? Yes. Unwashed? Certainly. But alive, which in the North Sea was about as fashionable as it got. If there was one particular body part that the Vikings truly feared losing to the cold, it was definitely their feet. Fingers were kind of optional. You could still swing a sword with a few missing. But toes? That was a serious problem. Nobody wants to go raiding Paris with feet that snap off like stale breadsticks. The human foot just wasn't designed for the North Sea. It was designed for walking around on dirt, not standing in frozen puddles on a wooden deck while your commander shouts poetry about honor. Viking ships were constantly soaked with seawater, melting ice, and the tears of men who realized this was their actual job. The result? Frostbite as a lifestyle. To fight it, they invented Viking socks. Not made of wool, not made of cotton, but made of grass. Dried sedge or moss packed inside their shoes like some kind of organic insulation. You'd stuff your boots full, squish your feet in, and hope that it stayed dry for more than 10 minutes. Some songs were about gods and glory, others about ale and women, and undoubtedly a few were about just how much they hated their current predicament. The sagas never mentioned sad sea shanties, but they absolutely had to have existed. You don't row across the Arctic Ocean in complete silence unless you've already given up entirely on joy. These were work songs, half melody, half guttural grunting, all timed perfectly to the rhythm of the oars. The overall result was haunting, primal, and occasionally a little off-key when someone's lips froze right in the middle of a verse. The music wasn't just to pass the time. It unified the entire crew. The same men who would argue over stolen rations would now harmonize like a deranged choir of freezing psychopaths. Singing drowned out the groans of the ship, the hiss of the wind, and that quiet, insidious voice in your head that kept whispering, "You really could have stayed home." And when the storms inevitably hit, when the sea howled like a banshee and the sky turned pitch black, they just sang louder. Not because it actually helped in any practical way, but because it gave them the feeling that they still had some say in what was happening. There's something beautifully idiotic about humans shouting into the teeth of nature's chaos. It's a sound that says, if I'm going down, I'm doing it in key. Some people say the gods actually heard those songs. Maybe they did. Or maybe the sound just got swallowed by the wind. But for the Vikings themselves, that didn't really matter. Singing kept the frost at bay, if only in spirit. Because in a world where warmth was a rare luxury, defiance was the next best thing you could hope for. And nothing defies the cold quite like a Viking chorus screaming their lungs out into the heart of a blizzard. For a people who worshipped gods who literally hurled lightning bolts, the Vikings did have one very unheroic fear. Fire. Not the poetic, candlelit kind, but the real, raging kind. The sin was far too common, and the entire system was far too fragile to risk exposing it. Even for the truly innocent, confession could be a form of agonizing torment. Priests, who were specifically trained to extract sin from every troubled soul, often found that their greatest battlefield was their own mind. After listening to hundreds of whispered temptations, their imaginations became disturbingly crowded with sins that they themselves hadn't committed, but now couldn't stop picturing in vivid detail. One contemporary chronicler wrote with dry humor that priests often emerged from the confessional far more inflamed with sin than the actual sinners they had just absolved. And yet, this questionable ritual continued unquestioned, year after year. The faithful still knelt obediently, the priests still listened intently, and behind the protective screen, human weakness quietly met divine expectation. The confessional was supposedly meant to erase sin, but for many of Tuda's clergymen, it simply recycled it, turning shame into longing, and longing right back into overwhelming guilt all over again. It was a perfect and self-perpetuating circle of hypocrisy, spinning endlessly under the church's silent and implicit blessing. Behind the high convent walls, where women had solemnly vowed to serve only God, love often found its own secret and circuitous pathways. The nuns of Tuda were meant to be the chaste brides of Christ, obedient, and completely detached from the many temptations of the outside world. Yet, convents were rarely as silent or as perfectly pure as the sermons so often suggested. They were, in reality, simply communities of young women, many of whom had been sent there not out of any deep personal devotion, but rather out of mere convenience. A family might choose to cloister an unruly or rebellious daughter, or secretly hide away an inconvenient pregnancy, safely out of sight. Here, under the same roof, you might find a Buddhist monk from Nalanda, a Nestorian priest from Mesopotamia, a Sufi mystic from Persia, and a Taoist scholar on pilgrimage. They arrived by camel, on foot, or in ox-drawn carts, bound not by trade, but by revelation. The road was their scripture, each inn was a verse, and every night their prayers rose together in a dozen tongues. In these shared courtyards, debate flourished, not about gold or silk, but about the soul. The Buddhist monk spoke of compassion and detachment, the Christian priest of redemption and grace, and the Sufi whispered of divine love hidden in the folds of existence. The air buzzed with words as incense smoke curled between languages. Sometimes faiths clashed, and other times they simply merged. It was in places like these that Buddhism spread from India into Central Asia and China, carried by monks who followed the same routes as the traders. Caravanserais gave them food, protection, and most importantly, an audience. A weary merchant might listen to a monk's parable after dinner and remember it long after the spices were sold. Likewise, Christian missionaries from the Middle East used the same shelters to reach the steppes, carving crosses on the walls beside older inscriptions in Sanskrit or Persian. The walls of some surviving inns still bear those marks, a silent record of theology and transit. Even the most practical of travelers often left with a touch of philosophy. The road demanded it. To face the desert's emptiness was to confront the divine. And so, between the buying and selling, men began to question the meaning of their journeys. What if the road itself was the teacher, and every stop a lesson? The caravanserai, for all its bustle, became a place of quiet transformation. Not only goods, but gods were exchanged here, reshaped, reimagined, and carried onward. Beneath its vaulted arches, faith became a traveler too, wearing the dust of many lands and the language of many hearts. By the time he finally reached the vibrant city of Alexandria, Ibn Battuta was no longer merely a simple pilgrim on a religious quest. He had become an integral part of a vast and dynamic network of scholars, seasoned travelers, and captivating storytellers, stretching from the Maghrib all the way to distant Arabia. He encountered holy men who claimed to have visions of Mecca, weathered sailors who swore they had seen islands made entirely of perfume, and eager students reciting beautiful poetry in the welcoming courtyards of mosques. Their incredible stories filled him with an intoxicating hunger to see more, to experience more, to truly immerse himself in the wonders of the world. From Alexandria, he journeyed down the legendary Nile River, marveling at the ancient monuments of Egypt and the bustling river towns, where Coptic Christians and Muslim traders lived side by side in relative peace and harmony. Each and every stop along the way revealed a world far larger and more complex than the one he had ever imagined in his hometown of Tangier. The road to Mecca still lay ahead of him, but the true pilgrimage, the journey of a lifetime, had already begun, not simply toward a specific city, but toward the seemingly infinite horizons of the incredible human world. When Ibn Battuta finally reached the holy city of Mecca after enduring more than a year of perilous travel, he felt as though he had arrived not just at the very center of Islam, but at the beating heart of the entire world. The city was alive with fervent faith and constant motion, as thousands upon thousands of pilgrims from Africa, Persia, India, and Anatolia all circled the sacred Kaaba in perfect, rhythmic harmony. It was a living, breathing map of the medieval world, drawn not with ink and parchment, but with the countless footsteps and heartfelt prayers of its devoted inhabitants. He now carried the immense weight of the world's collective memory within his own mind. The long road home would inevitably take him through lands both familiar and profoundly changed. As he retraced his steps through India, Persia, and Syria, he observed empires that had risen and fallen since he had first passed through them. Old friends were now gone, cities had been rebuilt, and even the unforgiving desert seemed different somehow. The world had undeniably aged, and so had he. When he reached the holy city of Mecca once more, he performed another sacred pilgrimage, this time not out of a sense of religious duty, but out of sincere gratitude. For all the countless miles that lay behind him, he knew just how easily his journey could have ended in an early grave. Afterward, he sailed to East Africa, visiting the vibrant Swahili coast, and thriving cities like Kilwa and Mogadishu, which served as bustling hubs of trade, where Arab, African, and Indian cultures beautifully intertwined. The rhythmic sounds of the bustling markets, the fragrant scent of cloves and valuable ivory, the familiar recitation of prayers at sunset, it all served as a powerful reminder of just how deeply connected the world had become through the shared bonds of faith and the constant exchange of goods and ideas. Finally, sometime around the year 1354, Ibn Battuta returned to Morocco, to the same quiet city where his incredible story had first begun. Tangier greeted him not with loud fanfare or public celebrations, but with the quiet, familiar comfort of home. Sadly, his parents had long since passed away. His childhood friends were now virtual strangers, and his homeland now felt somehow smaller than his vast, expansive memories. It rarely did, but at least it gave you the illusion that you were doing something productive while slowly freezing to death. The shoes themselves were pretty simple. Just leather wraps, more of a foot suggestion than actual footwear. You tied them tight, said a quick prayer, and tried not to think about the fact that you were basically walking barefoot on ice. Archaeologists have actually found Viking boots that look more like experimental origami than anything you'd actually wear. They worked, sort of, if by worked you mean delayed frostbite until lunchtime. Some guys would smear animal fat or tallow on their feet before they put on their grass socks. The logic was actually pretty sound. Grease repels moisture. The side effect, of course, was that the ship now smelled like a delightful combination of seal carcass and despair. Even at camp, there was really no relief to be found. You couldn't exactly dry your boots by the fire. They just shrink, warp, or burst into flames. So, you just kept wearing them day and night until your toes went numb enough to stop complaining. And yet, they marched on, they rode on, and they conquered. Because Vikings didn't let pain stop them. They simply rebranded it as endurance. So yes, they froze, they limped, and they occasionally lost a toe or two, but they also crossed oceans with nothing but grass in their boots, which in all fairness is probably still better insulation than whatever they put inside your motivational gym shoes. The kind that could turn your ship, your home, and your entire crew into a floating Viking barbecue. Fire represented warmth, yes, but it also represented treachery. You could always trust ice. Ice killed you slowly and politely. Fire, on the other hand, killed you loudly and without warning. Every Viking ship was absolutely soaked in tar, and packed to the gills with timber, rope, sails, and dreams. Basically, everything was on the Norse version of a what not to set on fire list. That's precisely why longships never carried open flames. No torches, no bonfires, no romantic candlelight dinners for two warriors and a goat. Instead, they relied on smoldering embers, tiny, manageable, and only slightly less suicidal. Lighting a real fire in the middle of a voyage was the kind of decision that guaranteed you'd be remembered in the sagas, but only as a dire warning. It wasn't just about the ship itself, though. Fire was considered sacred. Back home, it lived in the hearth, carefully tended by women, fiercely protected by the gods. and treated with the kind of reverence that modern people usually reserve for their Wi-Fi connection. The hearth fire was the center of life, a source of cooking, warmth, and protection. Extinguishing it was considered a spiritual offense, roughly equivalent to deleting your entire family history. At sea, however, the flame belonged to no one. It became something wild and dangerous, a god completely unchained. The Vikings deeply respected that. They also feared it. They carried fire in small ember boxes, whispering prayers as if to say, "Behave yourself, or we're all going to die." Ironically, their funeral rituals involved the one thing they avoided the most. A warrior's final voyage often involved a ship burning, that famous pyre on the water. Death was really the only time a Viking would willingly set a ship ablaze, because at that point, insurance premiums were no longer a concern. To the living, the flame represented chaos. And once the heavy gates slammed shut behind them, the constant struggle between the body and the soul inevitably began. Loneliness was often the first intruder. The monotonous daily rhythm of prayers, fasting, and mind-numbing chores tended to dull the mind and weary the soul. Eyes often lingered just a little too long on a fellow sister's face during hymn practice, or on the visiting priest who heard confessions with such gentle patience. Affection, in such a confined and isolated world, quickly became something dangerous and forbidden. Letters were secretly smuggled through kitchens and courtyards, passed from hand to trembling hand. A nun might innocently claim that she was simply visiting the garden to gather herbs, but her real harvest often waited for her just behind the sheltering wall. Historical records, though usually written with an air of moral outrage, often reveal fleeting glimpses of forbidden tenderness. One visitation report graphically described two nuns who had been discovered in embraces most unholy. Another spoke of hushed midnight whisperings and a fondness beyond sisterhood. The punishments were often humiliating: public confession, prolonged periods of fasting, or solitary confinement. Yet, none of it ever seemed to stop the underlying pattern. For some, the convent was not merely a prison. It was a place where love could actually hide in plain sight, carefully disguised under the subtle language of religious devotion. And then there were those whose sins were far riskier and more potentially damaging. Some nuns carried on secret affairs with visiting monks or even the confessors themselves. A few even became pregnant, their rapidly swelling bellies quietly explained away as dropsy or some kind of miraculous illness. The resulting shame was usually quickly buried, both literally and figuratively. A sudden illness, a quiet death, a hurried burial under the cold cloister stones. Though history often remembers the Silk Road as a man's world of merchants and monks, women were its quiet architects, unseen but indispensable. Behind every caravan's success was a network of wives, daughters, and innkeepers who kept trade alive when the men were gone. In the caravanserais, where the weary met the waiting, women's presence shaped the rhythm of the road as much as gold or silk ever did. Some were merchants in their own right. Central Asian women, especially among Turkic and Mongol tribes, managed trade caravans, owned inns, and negotiated contracts with travelers. A skilled trader's wife might sit cross-legged in a shaded corner of a caravanserai courtyard, haggling fiercely over a roll of brocade or a bag of saffron. Their authority was earned through reputation, and in a world without borders, reputation traveled fast. Others worked within the inns themselves as cooks, hostesses, or stable keepers, ensuring that every traveler, rich or poor, found a place to rest and eat. Then there were the storytellers, dancers, and musicians, women whose songs echoed through the courtyards after dusk. Their performances were payment and prayer at once, soothing the tired, charming the lonely, and spreading fragments of distant cultures. A dancer from Samarkand might wear Indian jewelry, perform Persian steps, and sing verses in Arabic, her art as fluid as the road itself. Through them, cultures didn't just trade goods. They traded rhythm, beauty, and myth. Even noble women found their place in the network. Royal wives and princesses from Persia or Mongolia sponsored caravans as acts of faith and generosity, ensuring that travelers, including monks and pilgrims, found safe lodging. Some of these inns bore their names, their legacies carved into stone lintels where caravans once passed beneath. But the road was also dangerous. Women faced risks far greater than exhaustion or hunger. Bandits, exploitation, and the slow erasure of their stories. For Ibn Battuta, the sacred pilgrimage fulfilled his religious duty, but it also served to open his mind and ignite his imagination. Mecca was far more than just a holy city. It was a vibrant crossroads of cultures and ideas. Merchants traded luxurious silks next to exotic spices. Brilliant scholars debated legal matters in the cool shade of swaying palm trees. And gifted poets recited moving verses under the soft glow of oil lamps until the first light of dawn appeared. Every man he met carried a captivating story from another faraway land, and Ibn Battuta was eager to hear them all. He began meticulously recording his experiences, carefully noting local customs, regional dialects, and the subtle ways in which Islam influenced and shaped daily life. Even amidst the overarching uniformity of religious practice, he observed an astonishing level of infinite diversity. After spending several months in Mecca, most pilgrims typically turned toward home, eager to return to their familiar lives. But Ibn Battuta was not like most pilgrims. For him, the wider world was still calling. He joined caravans heading north toward the fascinating lands of Iraq and Persia, determined to see for himself the ruins of ancient empires. His journey eventually took him through the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, where the crumbling ruins of Babylon lay buried beneath layers of dust and time, and onward to the majestic city of Baghdad, a city still radiating with the fading memory of the glorious Abbasid caliphs. Although the Mongol armies had brutally sacked Baghdad less than a century earlier, it still remained a powerful beacon of learning and intellectual pursuit. Its renowned madrasas, or schools, were filled with brilliant scholars from across the vast Islamic world. There, Ibn Battuta had the distinct honor of meeting respected judges, insightful philosophers, and talented poets, all eagerly exchanging ideas as freely as merchants traded valuable goods. But within him resided a vast empire of personal experiences, unforgettable sights and sounds from 4 different continents, intimate stories of powerful kings and humble fishermen, and vivid memories of crossing seemingly endless deserts and navigating treacherous oceans. At the request of the Sultan of Morocco, he meticulously dictated his incredible memories to a talented scholar named Ibn Juzay, ultimately creating the Rihla, or the Journey. Within its pages, Ibn Battuta carefully preserved not just the thrilling details of his own personal adventures, but also the vibrant pulse of the 14th century world. A vast, interconnected global network that was primarily bound together by the essential elements of trade, generous hospitality, and shared religious beliefs. His invaluable account has since become a vital bridge between different civilizations, a lasting testament to the powerful idea that simple curiosity can be just as sacred as the most fervent prayer. He had left Tangier as a relatively unknown pilgrim, and he returned as a respected historian of humanity. His remarkable map of the world was not simply inked with borders and territorial lines, but with countless lasting connections. It served as undeniable proof that, in an age long before accurate compasses and widespread colonialism, one single man could successfully ride across the known world, guided only by his unwavering faith, his boundless courage, and the irresistible pull of the vast and beckoning horizon. To the dead, it symbolized release. The very same element that could doom a careless sailor was the one that carried heroes off to Valhalla. So yes, they feared fire, but they also worshipped it because, with true Viking logic, if something can completely destroy you, it's probably sacred. And if it kills you quickly, well, that's just good efficiency. If the Vikings had one true religion, it really wasn't Odin, Thor, or Freya. It was suffering itself. The Norse gods might have gotten the temples, but pain got the devotion. Endurance wasn't just a virtue, it was a lifestyle. If you complained, you weren't a Viking. You were just an inconvenience to everyone around you. In Scandinavia, comfort was viewed with suspicion. Warmth made you soft, softness made you weak, and weakness apparently made you French. So from childhood, Vikings were taught that hardship builds character. And by the time they reached adulthood, they had accumulated enough character to survive freezing gales and emotionally repressed friendships. The sagas glorified it. He sailed through snow. They'd boast, bare-armed and laughing. What they conveniently failed to mention was that he was probably laughing because the nerves in his skin had died off an hour ago. Pain was proof of strength. Cold was proof of masculinity. A Viking wasn't truly alive until something was actively trying to kill him. Their gods reflected that mentality perfectly. Odin sacrificed an eye in exchange for wisdom. Tyr lost a hand to a wolf. Even Baldur, the god of beauty, was murdered purely for plot development, forced to suffer and smile his way through it. That was considered divine. The gods didn't bless comfort. They blessed endurance. So, the Vikings embraced the cold in the same way that monks embraced silence, with grim enthusiasm and a complete lack of any viable alternatives. They romanticized hardship simply because it was all they had. Every frostbitten voyage became an act of worship. God's mercy, it seemed, was always quicker to arrive when silence conveniently served the needs of the church. But beneath all the carefully constructed hypocrisy was something profoundly human. These women were not monstrous villains. They were simply being denied the basic right to be human in the first place. The vows they had so solemnly taken were essentially cages, constructed from rigid obedience and almost total isolation. And when they inevitably broke free, it wasn't merely an act of lust. It was an act of rebellion against a rigid system that actively forbade love itself. In their whispered promises and stolen touches, the nuns of Tudda lived out the one inconvenient truth that the church tried its hardest to suppress. That even in the most sacred of ground, desire inevitably blooms. Love was simply not supposed to exist in a Tudda convent. At least not the earthly kind. Yet, within the dim and flickering candlelight of these walled sanctuaries, hearts inevitably rebelled. The rules were clear and brutally simple. Absolute obedience to the abbess, strict silence after vespers, and complete and utter purity above all else. But the human heart doesn't really read canon law. The convent, which was originally designed to ruthlessly suppress temptation, instead became a veritable incubator for it. When you lock away youth, beauty, and longing behind high stone walls and endless prayer, desire doesn't simply die. It refines itself, becoming something even more potent and dangerous. Letters from the era vividly describe scenes that are both tragic and achingly tender. One young sister wrote in secret to a monk at a neighboring abbey, "I see thee only in my prayers, and yet my prayers are utterly full of thee." The letter was eventually intercepted, and her punishment was severe. A full week of fasting and public humiliation. But even after her genuine repentance, her forbidden affection remained, carefully hidden behind her daily hymns and countless penances. Yet their resilience was astonishing. They adapted, traded, entertained, prayed, and endured, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the Silk Road's life. Without them, the caravanserai would have been just stone. It was women who filled it with warmth, laughter, and language, who turned cold walls into homes and transformed the journey into a living story that still hums beneath the dust of the ancient road. Every caravanserai was built for survival, yet designed with surprising grace. To the traveler, its walls meant safety. To the builder, they were symbols of divine duty, an offering to both God and guest. From Anatolia's honey-colored stone hans to Persia's sun-baked courtyards and China's timbered way stations, the architecture of these inns reflected not only geography, but philosophy. Each one said, in its own language of arches and domes, "You are safe here, stranger." The typical design followed a rhythm perfected over centuries. A single monumental gate faced the road, often carved with verses invoking blessings for travelers. Once inside, a wide rectangular courtyard opened, flanked by rows of vaulted chambers. The lower rooms housed camels, donkeys, and horses, while the upper ones sheltered merchants and pilgrims. His sharp intellect and comprehensive knowledge of Islamic law quickly earned him respect wherever he traveled, and soon, invitations began to pour in from powerful governors, influential sultans, and respected scholars who recognized in him a rare and valuable combination of deep piety and boundless curiosity. For Ibn Battuta, travel had become both an act of worship and a form of higher education. Every road he traveled was like a new verse in the book of creation, and every stranger he encountered served as a wise and insightful teacher. Standing on the banks of the legendary Tigris River, watching the setting sun shimmer and dance across the ancient ruins of a fallen empire, he finally began to fully grasp his true purpose in life. He realized that he was not merely crossing borders and traversing landscapes. Instead, he was meticulously mapping the very soul of the world, one incredible journey at a time. By the time Ibn Battuta finally reached Persia, he was no longer viewed as simply a pilgrim or a wandering traveler. He was gradually transforming into a respected scholar of the world. His growing reputation as a learned man of law, combined with his natural charm and eloquent way of speaking, allowed him to open doors wherever he went. He found himself staying in both humble mosques and opulent palaces, debating complex theological concepts one day and dining with powerful princes the next. For a man born in a relatively remote corner of Africa, he now found himself moving through the very heart of the thriving Islamic Golden Age. Persia utterly dazzled him. He traveled through stunning cities still shimmering from the lasting legacy of the Mongol Empire, now ruled by the Ilkhanate dynasty, where traditional Persian artistry had beautifully blended with Central Asian grandeur. Every storm endured became a sermon. When the wind howled, they just howled right back. When the sea froze over, they pushed through it. When the gods ignored them, they simply shrugged. They were quite used to that. Suffering didn't mean the gods had abandoned you. It meant they were actually paying attention to you. Modern people chase comfort as if it were their salvation. Heated homes, soft beds, 12 different kinds of artisanal tea. A Viking would probably call that witchcraft. They didn't measure happiness in terms of luxury. They measured it by how long you could keep rowing without bursting into tears. And maybe, in some twisted way, they were actually right. Because while most civilizations prayed fervently for safety, the Vikings prayed for resilience, for the strength to face the cold and grin right back at it. They didn't just endure the elements. They became the elements themselves. And if that's not a religion, then nothing is. So, after enduring all that ice, wind, hunger, and those highly questionable life choices, how did the Vikings actually keep warm without fire? Well, the short answer is they didn't. The long answer is that they cheated death through sheer arrogance. For the Vikings, warmth wasn't something you simply had. It was something you actively became. They transformed endurance into pure energy, suffering into swagger, and cold into unadulterated character. They didn't need comfort. They needed a challenge. Fire was for the weak. Frostbite was just proof that you had been somewhere worth bragging about. She would later carve a tiny heart beneath the wooden bench of her choir stall, the closest thing she had to a lasting love letter. Visitors from outside the cloistered convent only served to fuel the flames of temptation even further. Traveling merchants, skilled stonemasons, and visiting confessors all regularly passed through the high convent gates, bringing news and tantalizing glimpses of the exciting world beyond. To young women who had been cloistered since childhood, even a kind smile or a gentle word could feel utterly divine. Some of the less scrupulous priests shamelessly exploited this vulnerability. A confessor might linger just a little too long after hearing sins, offering words of comfort that quickly crossed the already blurred sacred line. One particularly damning chronicle from 1538 tells the sordid tale of a priest who was caught sneaking into a convent late at night, poorly disguised as a simple pilgrim. His punishment was swift exile, though everyone involved knew that it was hardly his first offense. The sweeping Reformation only served to deepen this ongoing crisis. As royal inspectors began dissolving monasteries and convents across the land, they unearthed all the scandalous secrets that polite society had long suspected. There were nuns with illegitimate children, clandestine lovers exchanging passionate correspondence, and secret doorways connecting remote cloisters to nearby parsonages. Henry VIII agents, eager to discredit the existing Catholic orders, carefully documented every single juicy scandal they could possibly find. One particularly cold report matter-of-factly noted, "In the convent of Godstow, far more infants were born than psalms were ever sung." Yet, even amidst all this pervasive chaos, not everything was driven by sheer corruption and sinful desire. In Tabriz, he marveled at bustling markets overflowing with luxurious Chinese silks, fragrant Indian spices, and exquisite Damascus steel, undeniable proof that the ancient Silk Road still pulsed with life and vibrant activity. In Shiraz, he had the honor of meeting celebrated poets and accomplished jurists who recited beautiful verses from the works of Sa'di and Hafez, skillfully blending profound poetry with deep religious faith. To Ibn Battuta, Persia was not simply a place of immense wealth, but also a land of great wisdom, a place where intellectual pursuit and artistic beauty shared the same common language. His incredible journey continued eastward through the rugged mountains of Afghanistan and into the fabled cities of Khorasan and Herat, where he witnessed firsthand how the widespread Mongol destruction had slowly given way to a remarkable period of rebirth and renewal. Everywhere he went, he meticulously recorded what he saw, noting the way people dressed, how they practiced their religious faith, what they ate, and how they governed themselves. His travel notes, which were later compiled into the famed Rihla, or The Journey, would eventually become a valuable mirror, reflecting the interconnectedness of the medieval world. However, knowledge alone could not always protect him from the threat of danger. During one particularly treacherous desert crossing, his caravan was brutally attacked by ruthless bandits. He lost all of his personal belongings and very nearly his life. Yet, despite the harrowing experience, he bravely pressed on, choosing to interpret every trial and tribulation as a form of divine instruction. When he finally arrived at the great city of Delhi, he entered not as a beggar stripped of his possessions, but as a man who carried with him the accumulated wisdom of an entire continent. Some of these forbidden romances were undoubtedly genuine, the product of two troubled souls clinging desperately to each other in defiant opposition to a system that had actively denied them basic human affection. It wasn't just lust that flourished behind those high walls. It was a quiet and desperate yearning for love, companionship, and personal freedom. Three essential things that the very church itself had forbidden them from seeking. When Henry VIII finally broke away from Rome, the newly formed Church of England was born not out of any sort of deep holiness, but primarily out of raw lust, and the ever-present hypocrisy was simply too rich to ignore. Here was a king brazenly demanding spiritual independence simply so that he could divorce his aging wife and marry another, younger woman, while his bishops continued to preach strict chastity from gilded pulpits. The Reformation wasn't merely a political revolution. It was a mass unmasking of widespread clerical sin. Suddenly, the very men who had so readily condemned others for impurity found themselves stripped bare of their own carefully constructed illusions of virtue. Royal inspectors were hastily dispatched to dissolve the monasteries and convents, and they soon uncovered scandal after scandalous scandal. They reported with dry amusement that monks were living. Henry's agents, of course, played up the scandalous behavior they found. Wives with loose morals, priests fathering children, and nuns whose supposed miraculous illnesses turned out to be pregnancies. Every sin they uncovered was used as a reason to grab more church property. But there was undeniable truth to the accusations. The Tudor clergy had been preaching against temptation while secretly indulging in it. It seemed that lust had done more damage to Rome's authority than any sermon ever could. The hypocrisy went all the way to the top, from the pulpit to the throne. Henry himself used the idea of divine will to justify his affairs, claiming that God wanted him to have a male heir, no matter how many wives or mistresses it took to make it happen. The courtiers quickly caught on. Bishops blessed the king's marriages and annulments with a rehearsed show of piety, each one pretending that scripture somehow supported it all. Behind the facade of religious reform was a court obsessed with pleasure, gossip, and power, all thinly disguised under a veneer of religious duty. The common people watched all of this with a kind of weary amusement. The village priest was still keeping his housekeeper around, and the abbey walls still echoed with whispers of desire. The only difference now was that the crown, not the Pope, was collecting the confessions. The Reformation didn't eliminate lust from the church. It just brought it under the control of the nation. The same men who had once whispered Latin prayers were now toasting English queens, trading faith for favor, robes for gold, and vows for political gain. In the end, Henry's split from Rome revealed something that everyone had always known but few had dared to say, that the Tudor Church's biggest sin wasn't lust itself, but the denial of it. For centuries, desire had been the secret heartbeat beneath the hymns. And when the Reformation arrived, it simply ripped off the cassock, exposing the human desires that had always been there, trembling under the pretense of divine control. After Henry's break with Rome, the pulpits of England boomed with a new sense of authority. Priests, now loyal to the crown instead of the Pope, preached a purer, holier message. But despite all the talk of reform, the sermons still had a faint whiff of hypocrisy, and sometimes even perfume. The men who spoke out against Catholic corruption often had their own temptations hidden beneath their robes. The cassock might have changed allegiance, but their appetites hadn't. Many clergy members used their newfound freedom to live more openly, no longer hiding their lovers behind the label of housekeeper. Marriage for priests, once condemned, was suddenly allowed. But old habits die hard. Some took wives but continued to seek pleasure elsewhere. Others, emboldened by the Reformation, turned their sermons into displays of moral superiority, warning their congregations against the very sins they were secretly committing. The louder a man preached about purity, the more likely it was that he had something to hide.